Hey everyone, thanks for checking out part 3 of my Sony Playstation retrospective. We're covering the PS1 again, we're covering the years 1997, and this may be the year that gaming really started to get mainstream cool. I didn't realize it till right now, but actually thinking about the games that came out this year, quite a bit of stuff that people fondly remember who weren't gamers before this, so a lot of cool stuff to go through. There were about 189 games released for the PS1 this year by my count, and we're going to cover over 40 of them. We're going to cover the exclusive stuff. As usual, we'll do multi-platform stuff at some point in another video, but yeah, just going through the exclusive stuff for the PS1 this year. So when I say exclusive, I don't mean fully exclusive all the time, I just mean kind of console exclusive. Some of these games did come out on PC, and in many cases that is the better way to play them, but for people who only played consoles at the time, I just want to cover those as the kind of console exclusives that came out this year. Subscribe and share my old retrospectives if you dig them. It really helps me stay motivated for this stuff. Stuff has been really busy for me recently, so I haven't gotten as many of these out as I'd like to, but we're going to keep going ahead with them. I have so many more planned for this year. Thanks for checking this out. Let's just get right into it. A big year for the PS1. Starting with Soul Blade. This is the first game in the Soul Calibur series, and it had a bit of a cult following at the time, but not the popularity that it would get with its next release. Basically a port of the arcade game Soul Edge, but it features a ton of new stuff. 5 new unlockable characters, new costumes, weapons, and different soundtrack versions. There's also a new story mode in which the player moves around a map taking on different battles and learning the story of the 10 main characters in the game. A lot of fan favorite characters started here, and it's a bit rough compared to Soul Calibur, but worth checking out if you love the series. So next up, Command & Conquer. Obviously a much more important title for the PC and definitely the way to play it, but actually this version played pretty good. And yeah, this came out on other consoles later, but because the sequels came out on PlayStation, I'm going to give it some extra notice here. So yeah, this is the PC smash hit RTS. I spent a ton of time playing this over link cables with friends, which is kind of a crazy way to play things, but really worked for this game. And it controlled better than I think most console RTS attempts at the time. This was really a decent port. You couldn't move as fast as you could with a mouse, obviously, but it was okay for people who didn't have PCs. Overall, it was a pretty faithful port of the PC version, which was pretty surprising. It had both campaigns, one on each disc, and it still featured all the full motion videos and all that stuff that the series is known for. The game features the two factions, the SDI and the Nod, going up against each other. You could play through either faction's campaign. It was a lot of harvesting of Tiberium, I think they called it, and you'd use that to build bases and new units and go after each other. At this time, the RTS genre wasn't as huge as it became later, but the creators Westwood really did a lot to kind of push that genre forward. So a great game that people who only really know StarCraft might not realize is as important as it was. Following that, Vandal Hearts. An early isometrics view tactics game by Konami that has a bit of a cult following, but overall not one I really got into. In the game, the player recruits a number of characters for their team, and there's 7 different character classes. The game takes place in a world where the king was recently dethroned after a revolution, and while the new government tries to chase down the remainders of his supporters, your party stumbles upon a big conspiracy. It's interesting, it's something I wish I had a bit more time to really go through, because, just putting a couple hours in, it doesn't feel too incredible, but you never really know until you're done it how great these classic games could be. And after that, Battle Arena Toshinden 3, a fighter game that I dug at the time, but it's kind of hard to go back to. It is interesting just how floaty it is. It featured a huge cast of characters. It had a lot of unlockable characters that were just kind of alternate versions of the main characters. I think you can nearly double the starting roster. The game features some changes to the battle system that were used in the previous games, and surprisingly, the US and Japanese versions apparently feature big differences with how the blocking works and some of the physics. And then the first game I have in my collection, one I don't know if I'm going to really hang on to, but I picked it up for cheap and I have some fun with it. That is the Buster Bros Collection. This is the 3rd North American release of the Pang series, which is what it's called in Japan. It follows the Super Nintendo and Turbo CD releases, but this is a collection of the 3 arcade Buster Bros games. The original Buster Bros, Super Buster Bros, and Buster Buddies. The gameplay is pretty fun here, especially for playing 2 players. You control a character moving along the bottom of the screen, dodging these balls that are bouncing around, and shooting upwards at them to break them in half until they eventually just are destroyed. So yeah, fun game to play with a friend, and this collection of all 3 of them is great. Following that is Need for Speed 2. This steps down the sim aspects from the original release to focus on the more exaggerated courses and high-end cars that the series became known for, but the sim stuff is still there. The game still hasn't hit its niche that it was known for with 3, but it's a notable step towards that. One interesting mode they added here is a knockout mode where the last place car is eliminated in each race. And next up, a new version of a PC cult hit that's really difficult to play on the consoles, but still one I love. That is Descent Maximum. Like the first Descent PlayStation release, the gameplay here is pretty true to the original PC game. It's a kind of free-flying FPS where you are in a ship and can move in all directions. Instead of being a direct port of Descent 2 this time, however, this version includes 36 different levels that were designed for the PS1 specifically. So they're smaller and easier to play with a standard controller, although, that still takes some getting used to. I tried to go back to it to capture the footage for this, and yeah, just a little hard to kind of get that going again without the dual sticks or mouth controls. It's pretty difficult to play around, but still fun. And then Wild Arms, the first kind of great RPG for the system. The game features a really interesting setting and structure. It's a Western-themed world with sci-fi elements, including mechs, and the story revolves around these three characters who discover these ancient robots that awaken, and a bunch of crazy stuff goes down. The game features a 2D world with 3D battles, and there's some good exploration and puzzle design mixed in with the traditional RPG stuff. It has 3 playable characters who begin with different stories but meet up eventually to make up the party. Each character has unique abilities outside of battles that help the player progress, which is a nice change of pace for the game. The series has got a good cult following as well. It may not be as big as some other RPGs at the time, but definitely worth checking out if it's one you've never played. And next up, another one I have in my collection just because I love it so much, even though it's not a good port. That is Wing Commander 4: The Price of Freedom. Basically the sequel to Wing Commander 3, which also had a port on the PlayStation. This one also features Mark Hamill and some of the actors from the previous game, and shows the aftermath of the Karathi War. So now Maverick is dealing with a bunch of post-war relations, and he stumbles across a conspiracy with this new faction who's really starting up trouble. I really like the story. I really like the way this story unfolds in this game. It's very different from the previous games in terms of the narrative, but gameplay is pretty much exactly the same, and the gameplay here is really similar to the port of the previous game, so definitely much better to play on PC. It's still pretty rough here, but yeah, just a great game I like to have for myself. And next up, wow, we're going through all the games in my collection in a row, which never happens. Overblood, which is a sci-fi survival horror game that I think has a little bit of a cult following, but the truth is I just love it. I think a lot of people hate on this game. It is tough to control and really awkward, but I really love this game. I think this may be known as the first survival horror game to be fully 3D instead of just being 3D characters over pre-rendered backgrounds. The game mashes up elements from many genres, including adventure game puzzles and more action-based combat, and it features 3 playable characters, which you can switch between when they're in your party to use their unique abilities to get through puzzles. In the game, you control a character who's lost his memory, but wakes up in this kind of futuristic research facility after being put to cryosleep. Doesn't really know what's going on, no one else is around, and you're just exploring the station, dealing with monsters, trying to figure out what's going on. Again, overall, it's not a great game. The controls are clunky, everything moves a little awkwardly, but I love the genre, and I really like this unique take on it, so I really dig it. Alright, next up is Dynasty Warriors. The original PS1 game is pretty different from what the series would get known for later. It's just a standard 3D fighter with characters from Chinese history. The game features 16 characters, each has their own weapon, and the fighting system lets players parry their attacks by doing their own attacks at the same level, instead of your standard blocking mechanics. Obviously the later games are very different, and what they've known for is not this at all, but it is still an interesting idea that carries through to the later games. So these famous people from Chinese history, these warlords, are now brought into a fighting game. That's a big part of their history over there, and it really fits, and I can't really imagine it working in a lot of other countries, but really interesting that this is where it started. Next up is Dragon Ball GT Final Bout. Now this is the first Dragon Ball game to come out in North America, if you don't count the unlicensed Dragon Power for the NES, and it's a 3D fighting game based on the GT anime series, but it contains mostly characters from Z. Really, there's only like Young Goku and Pan from GT. And it's kind of a shame because it's a really bad game, but Dragon Ball was at its height of popularity, and everyone was really hurting for a good Dragon Ball game over here, and it just did not deliver for those fans. The game has a battle mode where you can play against another player or the CPU, and there's a tournament mode where you can pick a fighter to train and send against other players' fighters, just by saving your characters to the memory cards and going into that mode. It had such a small print run in 97 that it was really rare for quite a few years, but in 2004 it actually got a re-release, a much wider one that really drove down that price, so it's easier to find now if you're interested, although I don't recommend it. Following that, a game that was huge at the time, and probably the game that really popularized a series that went on for quite a while after that, that is Ace Combat 2. The game featured over 20 stages and over 20 aircraft you could fly. The plot surrounded a group of rebels getting their hands on dangerous weapons and trying to take over the government with them. It is a ton of fun. You know, a lot of people that wrote off these kind of action flight games at the time really got into it. And it was actually remade for the 3DS as Ace Combat Assault Horizon Legacy, so I didn't know that when I did my 3DS retrospective, but definitely one I would have included if I did. Following game I had in my collection for a while, but it's not one I love that much, and I have the SNES version, and that is Ogre Battle: The March of the Black Queen. Yeah, this was a limited edition, apparently, port of the SNES Real-Time Tactics RPG. It was also ported to the Saturn in Japan and featured voice acting and better graphics, but the PS1 version was a separate port that didn't feature those and instead had better battle graphics. Yeah, it's just an updated version of that original Ogre Battle game, which wasn't too popular here at the time, but did have a bit of a cult following. There were two different ports, one to Saturn and one to PS1, but we never got the Saturn port over here. The Saturn port had voice acting and better unit graphics, but the PS1 version that didn't have those had better battle graphics and different camera angles. Worth checking out if you like the series, especially to compare to the original version. And yeah, it's notable for that. I don't think a lot of people really knew this came out here. Following that is Syndicate Wars, a port of the second game in the PC Syndicate series. The game takes place 100 years after the first game. The story revolves around Eurocorp's war with the Church of the New Epoch. Like the first game, Syndicate Wars is an isometric tactical shooter in which the player controls a squad moving through each level to complete various objectives. This is a game that was really cool for the time, definitely easier to play on PC because of the mouse controls. You know, one I never really dug into enough to really understand how to play it well, but really a neat game, and I know a nostalgic game for a lot of people, but not one I really could get into. And following that, the game that brought RPGs to the masses, that really helped popularize video games, I think, for a lot of people at the time, Final Fantasy VII. The game had a production value that we'd never seen before. It had a huge push behind the marketing. The game blew up in North America and introduced a wave of new players to the genre. People who had never even heard of RPGs were just so excited for this game to come out. If you don't know, the game stars Cloud, who joins a resistance group to fight back against the evil corporation he used to work for, and his journey pits him against the insane legendary soldier Sephiroth. It features a ton of weird plot twists and stuff like that I won't get into, but yeah, just a crazy narrative for the time, a bunch of stuff that you've never seen in RPGs before, a futuristic setting for a lot of things. I mean, the game was still rooted in fantasy, but there were some places that just had a ton of sci-fi stuff. Obviously, the first act of the game in Midgar, all sci-fi looking, very dystopian, and the rocket ship later on, just a ton of stuff that meshes fantasy with sci-fi in a way that was pretty rare for the time. It's still a turn-based RPG, and the active battle system is in play there, and the new materia system was a huge change from the previous games, letting you really customize your characters to a point where you could really break the game, where all of your characters could be practically the same thing except for their limit breaks, which was the one thing that kind of differentiated them. There was a ton of unique side quests and mini games, some better than worse, but all interesting. Just a massive scope. It had snowboarding and chocobo racing and, the golden saucer, that whole thing. Motorbike section, just crazy stuff mixed in there. And overall, a game that really has an enduring legacy. A game that players really love for nostalgia, and because, really, some of it is really well designed. It is a really cool game despite its inconsistency with graphics and gameplay and how game-breaking it is and how the bad translation screwed up an already confusing narrative. I don't want to sound like I'm a detractor to this game. I actually do love Final Fantasy VII. I think it definitely doesn't deserve a lot of the people saying it's overrated. It is a bit overrated, but that doesn't mean it's a bad game by any means. And next up, the first game in the planned Oddworld Inhabitants quintology, Oddworld Abe's Oddysee. This is a 2D puzzle platformer in the style of Flashback or Out of This World. It has the player controlling Abe, a worker in a factory, who finds out that his species is being killed to make their products. He sets out to free the others and escape the factory, kind of building up a little bit of a resistance. The game features a ton of puzzles and platforming challenges in which the player must avoid or take out enemies while freeing and escorting the other Mochlins out. There's a lot of stealth mixed in with that puzzle platforming, but it also features a command system, so you can kind of control the followers you have to tell them to stop or wait and just guide them to the next save point. The game has been remade. A new and tasty version came out that was a remastered version that I have, so I may not hold on to this original, but yeah, it's definitely a game worth checking out if you're into this genre. A ton of interesting stuff to look up regarding the original plans for the quintology. We've only seen, I think, 2 of the games for that. I mean, there were a lot of Oddworld games, but they only did 2 of those original planned games, and a bunch of spin-offs, which are also great, but don't really count to that original plan, so worth looking into that if you're interested. And next, the second point-and-click adventure based on Terry Pratchett's huge fantasy comedy series, Discworld 2 Mortality Bites. This is a follow-up to the previous Discworld point-and-click adventure, which also came out on the PS1 as a port of the PC version, and we see a big increase in the production value and storytelling. The game stars Rincewind once again, who was the main character of the first 2 novels and a couple of the later ones, and this time he becomes the new Grim Reaper after the previous one is mysteriously gone absent. It's got a ton of humor in it, some pretty clever puzzles. It's a game worth checking out, although probably easier to play on the PC with a mouse and without all the loading times that it has, but this is how I originally played it, and I have a ton of nostalgia for this title. And following that, Mega Man X4. This was also released on the Sega Saturn, but unlike Mega Man 8, there isn't so big of a difference between quality. The Saturn one is a little bit better, but it's not nearly as night and day as the Mega Man 8 versions were. And since X5 and X6 came out on PlayStation, I'm just giving it a quick mention here, although I'll cover it more in the multi-platform episode when I get to that. Following that is Bushido Blade, a game that I had in my collection for a long time, but didn't really ever have people over to play it with, which is kind of the whole point of the game, so I got rid of it, but it's one I'm thinking about re-adding to my collection. This is Square's 3D fighter that has a big focus on realistic weapons damage. In each fight, it only takes a couple hits to take out your opponent. Head or body blows can be fatal, while hits to the limbs will leave your rival unable to use that arm or leg, limiting their attacks and mobility. The game has 6 characters with different strengths and weaknesses, and 8 different weapons, so it was pretty neat that you could choose a character and choose a different weapon for that character to make a different kind of combo. A ton of fun. The fights are over really quick. That adds a lot of tension to them. A really cool fighter game to play with friends. Following that, Duke Nukem Total Meltdown. This is a PS1 port of the original PC FPS hit Duke Nukem 3D, and is technically rough with some slowdown and frame rate issues, but is really notable for having a completely exclusive Force scenario. It has 6 new levels that weren't in any of the other versions, even though this has been ported to multiple consoles. The game is also one of the first to support the upcoming DualShock controller, but the implementation isn't what you'd expect from an SPS, so don't expect it to work that well. Again, it's really notable for those levels. I think there's a mod or something that you can play those on PC, so that might be a better way to check those out, but really notable for that at the time. Following that, IQ, Intelligent Cube. This was a cool puzzle game that takes place on a 3D platform made up of cubes. The rows of cubes rise and advance on the player and tries to crush them or just fall off the stage, causing them points. You have to kind of mark spots, which you then use to destroy the cubes. And there's different cubes which have different kind of properties that let you change up the gameplay a bit. There are some cubes that you can't destroy. There are cubes that when you destroy them, they create kind of a mine, and you can create this area to take out a bunch of cubes at once. It's a lot funner than it looks, so I do recommend checking it out. After that is Pandemonium 2. The follow-up to last year's 2.5D platformer sees the return of the sorceress Nikki and the jester Fergus, who now go on a new quest to get the power from a magical comet before the evil queen does. The game lets the player switch between characters before they go into each level, and the powers and abilities that are found in those stages work different for each character. It's a decent 2.5D platformer. I don't think it's quite worth going back to now, but for the time it was interesting. And following that, the first update to Resident Evil 1, the first of many, the Resident Evil 1 Director's Cut. Despite I think people expecting or someone claiming it to be uncensored at the time, it still had some censorship over the original Japanese game, but it added a ton of new features. There's an easy mode for people who found the game too difficult. There was a range mode, which is kind of like a Legend of Zelda Second Quest mode, where just all the items have been mixed up in different locations to give the player a new experience. And a big deal at the time, it also featured a bonus disc that included a demo for the upcoming Resident Evil 2. Yeah, I might not mention this later, so I'm just going to say it now. Next year, in August, a DualShock version of this game was also released, which featured a couple more minor tweaks, but most importantly, it featured an updated soundtrack and DualShock support. So that's probably the version to check out. I don't like the DualShock support that much because it is still tank controls. I love tank controls, but I know a lot of people don't dig it. Don't expect these analog versions to make the tank controls that much easier. It's not what you'd expect. It's just tank controls with an analog stick. But yeah, definitely worth checking out that version for the updated soundtrack anyway. Next up is Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha. This is Arika's take on the Street Fighter series. It's a 3D fighter by the designer of the original Street Fighter 2 and Final Fight, and this version comes out after 2 arcade versions of the EX Plus Alpha game. This one includes a total of 23 characters. About half of those are Street Fighter characters, while the rest are new original characters, including the fan favorite Skullmania. The gameplay is notably slower than other Street Fighter games at the time, and everything feels a bit weird in 3D space. It turned off a lot of players, myself included at the time, but I know quite a few Street Fighter fans who actually really loved it and loved the different take on the genre and actually really learned a lot about, traditional fighting game basics that I don't know, so maybe I should have put more time into it. It is a fun, interesting thing to check out for anybody, and the series has kind of endured with a couple different iterations and a kind of spiritual follow-up that came out last year. So yeah, it might be worth checking out if you're into Street Fighter. Following that, and yeah, if you can't tell, it's my favorite genre. I really do have a thing for these kind of janky survival horror games, but that is Clock Tower. This is actually the second game in the Clock Tower series, but it was the first one that was released here. We never got the SNES one, and the story in this one is a direct sequel to that, so it still makes sense on its own, but it would have been nice to have that backstory beforehand. The game is a mix of a point-and-click adventure and survival horror title. The game, as you play, a couple different characters throughout it, but really focuses on 2 main playable characters, one being the survivor of the first game and the Scissor Man attacks that happened in that game. So yeah, if you don't know anything about Clock Tower, it's a game in which people are terrorized by the Scissor Man, a kind of weird monster who's got giant scissors, who stalks people around locations and kills them. And the whole point of the game is to kind of stay alive while trying to escape those environments. You find items, some of which you can use to kind of fight back, but mostly just to get out. You have to hide and hope he doesn't find you, and just move through the game trying to uncover the story of the game. Notably, there's a whole bunch of different endings depending on choices you make, and some really arbitrary stuff that makes it difficult to get them all without a guide. Definitely worth checking out if you're into survival horror games, but like I said, it is kind of janky. It doesn't control quite as smoothly as you'd like, so maybe harder for people who didn't play it before to get into. Following that, a contender for one of the best PS1 games, although maybe also for one of the best games of all time, that is Castlevania Symphony of the Night. This game came out at a time when Sony of America was really pushing back against 2D games, keeping a bunch of them from coming out over here, so it's great that we got Symphony of the Night, which really showed us that 2D games can really still be amazing at that time. The game follows up on the unreleased Rondo of Blood, which was for Turbo CD, but we had a scaled down version in the SNES's Dracula X. It combines the traditional Castlevania gameplay with a Metroid-like world structure and a ton of action RPG elements to create a really amazing title. After the end of the last game, which you replay a kind of easy version of in the beginning of this one, you play as Alucard, who's exploring Dracula's castle trying to figure out what's going on. There was a ton of great narrative stuff introduced here, about Alucard and Dracula and Alucard's mom, and just some really neat stuff that you didn't really get in previous Castlevania games. There's also some really great bad dialogue and delivery, which really created a bunch of memes and are just really well-quoted lines by gamers. A ton of fun stuff here. But the gameplay is really where it stands out. There's so much to it. There's a ton of different weapons which act different. There's shields and armor which really change up your gameplay quite a bit. There's unlockable abilities and spells and familiars, just a whole bunch of ways to customize your character, a ton of secrets in the game. Obviously, there's the huge notable secret of the kind of second world, which I won't mention in case you haven't been spoiled, although I don't think anyone who cares about this game hasn't been spoiled at this point. Just so much in this game, worth checking out. If you've been turned off by the hype or, just can't get into it, I do recommend giving it another shot. Try to separate yourself from the hype and just give it a shot because it's such a great game. Following that, Armored Core, the first game in From Software's mech action series, which I had a ton of fun with at the time. This is another game I used to play over link cables with my friends. And so if you don't know about the series, it's a game where you customize and pilot a big mech through a bunch of different missions with different objectives. Depending on how well you do in the missions, you get different amounts of money and you can use those to buy new parts. There's a ton of different weapons, legs that give you different traversal options. There's melee weapons and missiles and regular guns. Just a ton of customization options to this game for the time that made it so much fun. I really wish the series got a bit more of a following than it did because this is something that still could be really cool to this day if they really put the effort to make it a great game. With From Software's kind of reputation now, I think maybe they could bring it back and do something incredible with it, but I don't think we're going to see that. Following that is Bloody Roar, the first in Hudson Soft's 3D fighting series that features various werebeasts as characters. The game has 8 fighters who each turn into a different animal, including fox, wolf, lion, gorilla, rabbit, and more. Each fight starts with the characters in human form, and they can change into their beast form when their bar fills up. Not a great fighting game, but still a really interesting one. It's worth looking at. After that, Colony Wars, which was an exclusive first-person space combat series, and the first of 3 games in that series that were on the PS1. Compared to the Wing Commander ports, just a much better game overall because it was designed for the PlayStation. It looks better, it plays better, just a really cool game worth checking out if you're into that genre. The plot involves a league of space colonies who are at war with the Earth Empire. The game pre-selects your ship for each mission, but there's 8 different ships that you can play as, and really notably, depending on which objectives you complete or fail throughout the game, it changes the path of the story a little bit. Following that is Command & Conquer Red Alert. The first game in the big spin-off series to Command & Conquer is kind of an alternate world setting for the series, but features familiar gameplay and unit types. The game has 2 different factions that have new units and different strengths and weaknesses, and it shows the war between the Allied forces and the Soviet Empire in an alternate World War II where Hitler didn't come to power. Like the original Command & Conquer, the game has 2 discs, one for each faction's campaign, and features new actors in new full-motion video cutscenes that tell the story. After that, a game that I keep purely for my own nostalgia because I spent so much time with this as a kid, that is Cool Borders 2. This is a big follow-up to the original game, which I didn't know anyone who played that one at the time, but this one, everyone was playing. It featured better courses and new modes, and it's definitely a personal pick, as I mentioned, just because I played so much of it, and I consider it the high point of the series. The gameplay really switches up with 3. This game has a couple new modes from the previous release. There's your kind of traditional tournament mode where you go through a bunch of races trying to get the best times and score points from doing crazy moves. You also have a half-pipe mode where you can practice and a couple other things. Your starting position in each race is determined by what moves you pull off a kind of high jump, and you can pick between different characters and snowboards to customize things a little bit. It's probably hard to go back to now for a lot of people, especially if you didn't play it back in the day. You may hate the controls because they require some more foresight than later snowboarding games. In this game, you have to hold down a button, which kind of keeps you stationary while you power up for the move you're about to do, and you have to kind of know how long to hold it for to know, that you're not going to wipe out when you land. A lot of people might find it frustrating. I really love it. Following that is Ghost in the Shell, a first and third person shooter that's based on the original manga. It features a story and designs by the original manga's artist, Masamune Shiro, but apparently it doesn't fit in the same canon as the original manga, which is a big missed opportunity in my opinion. But in the game you play through a variety of missions as the tank Fuchikoma. who can crawl on walls and ceilings and take out enemies with its weapons. It features 6 training missions and 12 main missions. The missions take place in different environments and feature different objectives. It's a pretty interesting game, and walking around on the walls and ceilings and stuff is pretty fun to control. Following that is Jet Moto 2, a follow-up to the first-party hover bike racing game that's really just improved everything about the original. It's pretty much the same gameplay experience, and it features 10 new tracks as well as all the tracks from the original can be unlocked. If this is a game you want to have in your collection, it's really worth noting that the Greatest Hits version is a Championship Edition that features some gameplay and performance tweaks, so definitely the better version to play, even though they don't really call it out as such. And following that, a game that modern TVs makes really hard to play, but such a cool game, Parappa the Rapper. This is the narrative rhythm rapping game that was a huge hit at the time for its character, style, and songs. The original gameplay was pretty janky, with the timing being really specific and it being pretty confusing to know which beat to start your line on. This is probably to keep players from just beating it in such a short time, because I think you can get through the game in like 20 minutes if you are perfect at it. But it was already tough at the time on CRTs, and so now trying to play it on a modern TV with, new latency and stuff that's been introduced, it can be really tough to get through. It's still worth checking out. The songs are great, the characters are great. Just check it out if you've never seen it before, because it's something worth seeing. And next up, a game I teased last year, Star Wars Masters of Terraskasi. This is a Star Wars fighting game that's really only notable for being just bad. It features 13 playable characters from the Rebel Alliance and Empire, including Luke, Vader, Leia, Han Solo, Chewbacca, Boba Fett, and more. It's a shame that it's pretty rough and is not a great fighting game, because it also features Mara Jade from the Thrawn trilogy and Jedi Knight expansion that is just one of my favorite characters in the expanded universe who doesn't get enough game time. Next up is Time Crisis, a port of Namco's arcade light gun shooter, which featured a cover mechanic where you stepped on a pedal to take cover and reload. The PS1 port supported the Namco Guncom, which was really cool at the time, and really the gun to play any light gun shooter on the PS1 with. It was a decent port of the arcade game and featured a new side story mode where your performance in each mission affected your path through the game. And next up, Tomb Raider 2, the follow-up to kind of that first big game. The game sees Laura exploring new locations in Tibet, China, and Italy looking for the Dagger of Xi'an. The environments are way more varied than the first game's tombs and caves. This time there's a city and a shipwreck and a kind of mountainside. It introduces new vehicles, including a boat and snowmobile, and some new weapons like the underwater spear gun, a grenade launcher, and flares that you can use to light up the environment. Overall, a great follow-up to the original, though pretty rough to go back to now. Right after that is Crash Bandicoot 2, Cortex Strikes Back. In this game, Dr. Neo Cortex gets Crash to help him collect crystals, telling Crash it'll save the world. It has 5 new worlds, each with 5 levels and a boss, and the gameplay is pretty much the same as the original game, with Crash running upwards or downwards to avoid obstacles, take out enemies, and search for secrets. Everything is just improved. The difficulty is a lot more fair than the first game. Now you can play this on the updated trilogy, so you can check that out there if you're interested in the series. Next is Lethal Enforcers 1 and 2, a compilation of the arcade light gun shooters that can use the PS1 light guns to play, and were better ports than the 16-bit console version, but still not great. The first game is police-themed, while the second game is a Wild West shooter. The real problem with these ports is that they weren't really updated to work well with a controller, and so you get smoked pretty quickly. You just can't move that cursor fast enough to keep up with the action compared to using a light gun. So that's the way to play it if you have a light gun and a CRT to play it on. And next up, a massive deal for the time, the PlayStation DualShock Edition. So we finally get the DualShock controller. It's got the 2 analog sticks and the analog button. This was such a big deal at the time because like Nintendo had a stick and the C buttons, but it just didn't quite feel as good as the dual sticks for, upcoming games. We still are going to see developers struggle with how to use these two sticks for the next year or so, but eventually it's going to become the standard, and every game that we play now, it uses these in different ways, and with how commonplace it's become now, it's really hard to imagine that we didn't have those at some point. That came out in November 20th of 97. Obviously, the controller was released separately for purchase without the bundle, and a lot of people would be upgrading in the next couple years as some games came out that are just so much better with it. And next up is Monster Rancher, which was a really cool for the time monster breeding simulation game where you created monsters based on CDs that you put in the console. It's kind of a take on Tamagotchi and, building off the popularity of Pokemon, but the gameplay mostly revolves around you raising your monster to fight in different tournaments. The really fun part of the game was trying out all your different music and game CDs to see which ones resulted in really unique or powerful monsters, and then sharing your results with other friends who were playing the game. And the last game I have in my collection for the year with a whopping 5 discs is Riven, the sequel to Myst. Again, better to play on the PC, but I think the PC versions were really hard to get running over the last couple years, so definitely an easier way to play it, if not as good. The game really builds on the story from the first game and the 2 novels, which are great reads. I recommend them if you haven't read them. One of my favorite gaming stories of all time. But yeah, it follows up on the ending of Myst, where you're hanging out with Atris, and now you're going to travel to Riven. We're going to try and save his wife from his evil granddad. It's a whole bunch of drama going on here, but at the end of the day, it's just like Myst. It's all about randomly exploring places, trying to figure out how the hell these puzzles work, just pressing things and seeing what happens, and, trying to intuit how to get through the puzzles in these games. Notably, most of the puzzles are manageable, but I specifically remember one crazy annoying puzzle about these rolling balls and animal sounds they make. That puzzle is almost enough to make me not even want to try to play this game without a guide for that puzzle, because I'm sure a lot of people did it, but for me, that just put me over the edge. So, but that's just a personal complaint. Mostly a great game. So yeah, thanks for checking out this part 3. It's been a long time coming, and a lot of people have been waiting for it, so thanks for being patient. I'm going to get to part 4 sometime soon too, and a whole bunch of other retrospectives I have planned. So yeah, thanks for checking this out. Like and subscribe. Check out my older retrospectives. I've done a ton of stuff, and I got a ton more coming up. So yeah, see you guys next time. Bye.